Now I have you on the screen. Oh, okay. So, welcome to everybody here to this morning session. This is supported by the CEPA, the Schwarz Center of Policy Analysis of the New School and Economics Department, run by Teresa Gialaducci. And this is also supported, this event, by the Thyssen Foundation. We get for some years already some grants for type of talks and events that we are organizing since years, but this one will be more on, well, more recent research. So it's a research workshop with mostly current and future, or current and possible future and past graduate students, mostly from the new school. And the idea is basically to bring in more now also next generations of researchers on this topic. And well, there are next generations of activists are already on the street. So the next generation of researchers are welcome to join us as well. So this is on climate change and macroeconomics. So everybody probably knows already what that is. It is basically the, well, climate events hit the macroeconomics and economic social life with great cost nowadays. Policy is trying to mitigate CO2 emission and climate change. And mainly now policy feels, at least in Glasgow, that the stage of adaptation is very urgent. So in other words, how we adjust to the coming disasters or losses, in particular the well-developed countries, but in particular then the low-income countries will be affected by those events. And we have somewhat two parts here, as you see from the outline up there in our schedule. The first part, we have an overview on some research that's going on among the young research until 1 o'clock or 1:15, and then we have a book presentation by Markus Brunnemeyer. Markus is one of the very interesting macroeconomists in our times, and he wrote a book on resilient society, which the presentation will take place at 2 o'clock, and Bill Milberg will introduce him. I will give some comments, and I have collected a small panel that will also respond to this new book of Markus. So that will start at 2 o'clock. But I think now we can just start with some remarks of Mark Setterfield, who's our department chair, and all the topics that are discussed in Mark's book, namely tipping points. He is very well equipped on this because there were many tipping points during the Corona crisis, and Mark managed them very well. So Mark, please make your remarks now.
Thanks very much, Willi. So once again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Setterfield, and I'm currently Chair and Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research in the Department of Economics. And of course, I'd like to begin by welcoming everybody to the New School for today's workshop on climate change and macroeconomics, new perspectives on climate economics. I'm sure I don't need to convince anyone in this audience that even as climate disasters are on the rise, the recent COP26 conference has demonstrated that the required international response to the increasingly grave situation we face is anything but assured. In fact, I think they're still scribbling on their third draft, aren't they, as we speak and meet today. So I think against this backdrop, the timing of today's event is just about perfect. Evidently, the topic of climate change and the threat it poses to macro performance, and in fact much else besides, is in need not just of new perspectives, but also fresh impetus. I'm proud to say, actually, that today's workshop follows a long-standing concern with climate change and its social and economic consequences in the Department of Economics at the New School. And I want to just point out that Professor Willi Semmler, of course, as a leading investigator in the field, deserves a great deal of credit for that. As chair of the department, it's also a particular pleasure for me to see so many of our current graduate students, as well as recent alumni, contributing to the program. And of course, it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Marcus Brunemeyer of Princeton University to the workshop. I know that Marcus will, of course, join the workshop this afternoon when he'll make a presentation of his new book, The Resilient Society. And in fact, I can't just help but insert a comment here, almost on a sort of personal note. I've always found it curious myself that, we economists spend endless amounts of time thinking about the stability of economic systems, but we seem to pay precious little attention to what I think is arguably a more important concept, and that is whether or not they're even resilient. So I was actually delighted to see the workshop is devoting an entire session to that topic. So bravo for that. So on behalf of the entire department, I just want to reiterate what Willi said in thanking both the Tyson Foundation and the department's own Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis for supporting today's event. And I also want to thank the organizers, not just Willi, but of course, Jose and Joao, for all of the time and effort that they've put into putting together today's program. So finally, once again, welcome everybody to the New School, and in fact, thank you for contributing to what I'm sure will be a very successful workshop today. So I'll concede the floor now to Jose, I think, who is the moderator for the first session.
All right, well, Jose, Joe, are you taking over first, I think, yes? Or no, yes? No. Jose.
No, I think I'm going to moderate the first session. And given that we are already 9:10, let's move forward. The first speaker is going to be Gabriel Padró Rosario, who's going to talk a little bit about the economic cost of a hurricane, a case study of Puerto Rico and Hurricane Gorgeous 1998, using synthetic control methods. All right, Gabriel, the floor is yours. I strongly encourage everybody to stick to the 15-minute presentation so that we can have a 5-minute discussion afterwards. And I'll let you know 5 minutes before the end of the time, right?
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Jose. I'm gonna try and make the limit. Okay, let me share here. Okay, is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So thank you very much for inviting me to the seminar. Willi and Joao and Jose. I'm going to talk about a prior work that I did. It's called Cost of a Hurricane. It's a case study of Puerto Rico and Hurricane Gorgeous in 1998 using a synthetic control group, right? So I kind of did, I hope nobody gets dizzy, but I try to arrange everything in five topics. I'm going to try and do the limits. So it's just a brief introduction, followed by just brief natural disaster literature, some economic variables of Puerto Rico and the method that we use. Also, if there's time, I'm going to talk some placebo tests that we did just to test for robustness, right? So why is it important, right, to study the role of natural disasters? So there's just some basic, right, some natural disaster examples, but I forgot to include COVID because it's also a natural disaster. So there's some humanitarian consequences, right, for earthquake, floods, drought, and hurricanes, and other natural hazards. So they do a lot of damage in a very short time. So that's very important, usually to infrastructure. That damage is very noticeable, usually very big. And most studies are done on the social impacts. For example, post-traumatic effects of the hurricane or just natural disaster, or the damage of the flora and the fauna. So it's very important to really study this disasters or these events because they frequently from now on will only increase. So it's very important to take that into consideration. So this is actually, I just draw just to make a geographical, right, to everyone be on the same page. That's actually Hurricane Georges. That's gonna be, that's Puerto Rico, and that's the actual path in 1998. So what were the short-term effects? There were a lot of estimates. There were around 4.2 billion in direct damage. And it was around 8% of the GDP, which it was a lot. But what were the long-term effects on growth? So the purpose of this study is to know what would happen if Georges would have never gone through Puerto Rico. So this method is going to help us to tackle this, right? So the reasons is the EAI is the Economic Activity Index of Puerto Rico, is an index that reflects the movement of the GDP. So you notice there's a sudden decrease in 1998. It's a recent hurricane with 20 years of data, and we have pre-data, which is very important for this study. Also, we have post data. Is also a natural occurring event. There's no uniqueness to it. So that's very also important. It's not an endogenous event. So let's move on. Just a small natural disaster literature review. It's very important to distinguish between the short-term effects and the long-term effects, right? It's evidently that there's a negative impact because of the disasters, but it's usually on the developing and low-income countries. That's I just put some studies that reflected that. But developed countries can really withstand the effect of a natural hurricane. But in terms of the long-run effects, most of the studies, it's very difficult, right? Because you have to construct a counterfactual to compare, right, to know the difference. And some studies usually use ARIMA estimations, or actually Kaufman and Noy. They actually did the synthetic control group in Hawaii for Hurricane Iniki. And they actually found Caballero that if there's a political event, the natural disaster due to a political event is gonna be, it was negative. So, but what about role of the aid, right? There's a lot of transfers of money after a natural disaster. So it was found that DA really didn't, sorry, I'm gonna, okay, yeah, I'm hiding the pictures. So DA usually is better if it's given to the victims rather than given to the economy. So this helps growth after the natural disaster. But also it's considered external debt, which mostly the developing countries have a lot of debt involved, so apparently has no relationship. Okay, so moving on just to see the variables of the economic variables of Puerto Rico, which is the country under study. So this is the EAI, this is the Economic Activity Index from 1988 all the way to 2000. It's a monthly data, and it's an index composed of cement sales, gasoline, electricity, and employment. And those dotted red lines, you'll see Hurricane Hugo, which is a hurricane that went to 1989, 88, I think. I wasn't born. And you'll see a sudden drop there. But when you notice Hurricane Georges in 1989, 88, you'll see the decrease is quite bigger. Here we see a bigger picture. Okay. So the damages, you see that most of the costs, the short-term costs, right? There's a lot of many estimates. The NOAA, for example, estimated at 3.6 billion, but the government estimated at 4.3. So there's some discrepancy there. Huh? Also, the electricity power was down 100%, but it depends on who really gets out the data. Also, monetary response. There were some an influx of transfer of money of 4.1 from federal and local agencies. So there was a big amount of money involved. So for the method, I'm gonna try and wrap this very, very fast. Usually you need 3 types of variable for this method to work, actually involve growth variables for people, economic and financial variables. But the important part is that a synthetic control group creates an artificial unit in order to compare outcomes. So we have to really take into consideration the pre-period. We'll see just in a moment. This study, there's just a couple of studies that were very significant in this this method. It was done by Abadie, which they try to get the cost of German unification, right, and what would happen to the GDP. And they found that West Germany, they estimated to be 12% higher than the actual Germany, right? Another study, just to go through it, is also by Abadie. Abadie was one of the pioneers of the study. They studied the cost of terrorism in the Basque Country. And they constructed, right, a synthetic Basque Country, and they found that the Basque Country declined about 10% relative to the synthetic one because of terrorism, right? Another study was done here in the US. It was what were the effects of the tax on smoking, also by Abadie. They found in California that sales were about 20%, 20 packs lower in the absence of the law. So it's very useful for policy, the method. So for this method, you need a balanced panel data. So you need data for every of the countries. So you need a treated unit. For our study was Puerto Rico, and some untreated units, which are gonna be the donor pool, right? You need a dependent variable, which we use the GDP, PPP, just to comparative purposes. And we use some characteristics, which we use 9 characteristics for the 62 countries. So there was a lot of data involved. So this is briefly the first equation of the synthetic control group method. It just uses linear programming, and if we focus on the center of the equation, X1 are the values pre-events of Puerto Rico, so before 1998, and X0 are going to be the values of the excess of the characteristic of the donor pool, which is multiplied by W, which is very, very important, which is going to give us the weight, and that weight. This equation actually minimize the weight, and that way is going to be multiplied by the outcome, and then is where we see the difference. So here we see the W star, which is the weight that I was just talking about, and finally it cannot be summed up, right? And this equation, this is the synthetic control estimator equation. So this is very important because it's going to help us, right, get the magnitude of aggregate level, it's actually gonna help us address the natural impact on growth, natural disaster, right? Also, it prevents bias. That's very important because this method uses a parallel trend assumption, which is actually that it needs to be very, very close to the actual units prior to the event. And some alternative methods like diff and diff and OLS, they're biases because they assume constant trend, right? So this just resuming, we need to get the weights to simulate Puerto Rico being the treated units. So we need a panel potential donors, excluding Puerto Rico, and this is the period of study, 1991 all the way to 2010. This were the considered potential units. There were around 62 countries. Again, most of them share some similarities in terms of the 9 variables chosen. Others didn't, but thanks to the estimation, the linear programming would allow us to choose the weights automatically. So these countries were not included in the donor pool because they were affected by the hurricane, usually countries in the Caribbean and the lower part of the US, see Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, etc. So these were the characteristics. We use variables of education, population, and also economic variables Here are the 9 variables that we use. We use variables for population, trade variables, price levels, life expectancy, education, etc. And these were the countries that gave more weight. So they helped construct the synthetic control group. Ireland gave like 3/4 of the weight, followed by Santa Lucia and Tonga, and actually 76%, which was quite high. And this is actually how you see in the output. So some countries, they just receive 0 weight. You can see in the table. And yeah, okay.
Oh, you have 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay, I'll wrap it up. So this is actually the main table of the study. You'll see here on the left all the variables that we used. Right next to Puerto Rico, which has 2 columns, the real one, the actual one, that's the average of all the variables. And we see the synthetic one, which is very, some quite similar. I'll say maybe on the ratio GNP to GDP was a little bit off, but everything was a bit similar in comparison to the other average of the 62 countries. So you see the big difference there. And this is actually the graph that shows the difference, the effect of the hurricane. You see that the dotted line is the hurricane, before it's just the pre-event. You see that there's some parallel assumption, and we comply with it. And this can be translated into the effect of the hurricane affected 10% of Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico hasn't really recovered after the hurricane. This is actually, yeah, the gap. I'm gonna just go to the placebo. So there's 2 types of placebo, time and space, just changing the time in the country. We get no significant effect for Ireland, and changing the time doesn't really affect. Just a different diff that was made, and the conclusion. So Georgia's caused a best effect of 9%, the average gap of the GDP in 12 years. So the response actually is really important after the hurricane, we see in the graph. And yeah, it's just some limitations. It's very time intensive and labor intensive, just to make the sink and everything to be well. So I'll finish here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Yeah.
So the audience, in case you have questions, comments, please raise your hand and keep briefly. We have roughly 5 minutes for a discussion. Yeah, Andreas, please.
Hi, really nice presentation. Thanks, Gabriel. It's actually the first time that I hear someone present about a synthetic control method after having read about them. And I read them in the context of labor market regulations and impact of right-to-work laws in the US, where people tried to show what would have been the impact on other states if they also had put right-to-work laws earlier, or states who put if they didn't. And there was a critique in terms of the situations that the few states were in, because it's very hard for the right-to-work states that are out there, that sort of many right-to-work laws actually started in the 40s and 50s, but there was no good data. But there are 2 states, Louisiana and I think Wyoming or another one, that introduced right-to-work laws in the 70s, and their better micro-census data were available. So they tried to estimate effects for all right-to-work laws based on the 2 more recent states who came up with the right-to-work laws. And they actually said that the differences between states, if you look on the labor market perspective and throughout time, they have been quite significant. And we're like, this is a critique to the synthetic control method, was that the representativeness of those states who were taken, I don't know, maybe in your language it's the donor pool, were kind of not good enough to actually extract information on the other one. So how would you counter that critique in terms of your project? Is it that you'd say the predictor mean table actually shows a good fit, or what would be a reaction to, does your synthetic control method actually really fit for Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I think the difficult part is just having a good donor pool. And you have to take into consideration some similarities, and so that's, I think, one of the limitations. For example, we wish to include Jamaica because Jamaica wasn't affected by the hurricane, but we needed data because it's a very we just missed one data, and we couldn't include it in the pool. And actually, Jamaica would help a lot. But yeah, we couldn't include it. So there's some limitations in terms of the data and similarities on the economy. So yeah, I agree with you, Neves.
Other questions? João, please.
Thank you, Zé. Thank you, Gabriel, for the presentation. It was great, and your PowerPoint is just amazing. Congratulations, and the research as well. So two questions actually regarding the reaction of the government in Puerto Rico after disasters. Did they do like any economic policy response to that? Does it affect the results, or it was just like a non-reaction strategy at that point?
I mean, it's not a unique situation because event. There's been many hurricanes in Puerto Rico, and usually it depends on how the government responds, right? It's basically how it impacts people. But I'll say there's besides some policy involving the electronic grid, there's no other really policy because I think yeah, once the electronic grid electricity is down, like everything is just doesn't really just gets affected. But policy related, I'll say just there's literally none. So yeah, it's something to improve.
Thank you.
All right, Gabriel, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. We move forward now to host Julia.
Thank you.
She's going to talk about the multiple dimensions of climate justice with a focus on climate justice across countries. So Julia, the floor is yours. If you want to share screen, you're able to.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Semmler, for inviting to this conference and curating us. And thank you, of course, to João Paulo Braga, José Pedro, Bastos, Neves, for organizing us. So I want to speak about the multiple dimensions of climate justice with a particular focus on climate justice across countries. And this is research that I developed at the New School in cooperation with the Department of Economics and the Environmental Studies program at the School for Public Engagement. And the larger topic, climate change, you can see here the world surface temperature. Since it's recorded 1880, it definitely shows an upwards trend. And I'm particularly interested in the inequality aspect of climate justice, especially with a focus on in-between world countries. But I've also learned a lot from the environmental studies students on the societal impact. Alissa Wu has done, for instance, excellent work on how marginalized groups feel pressure within society from climate change mitigation and adaptation. Overall, my methodology features philosophical roots, legal foundations, but primarily focused on economic modeling, and especially with showing light at the inequalities. I only do this in order to find redistribution schemes, and today I will present very preliminary data. I've created some indices of a taxation and bond strategy in order to share potential gains from climate change around the world. So how did I measure potential gains from global warming around the globe? When you macroeconomically only look at the economics, you can say that the world countries differ by a mean temperature. So we all agree that Canada has a different mean temperature than Australia. Then countries also differ by GDP composition. So countries have different parts of agriculture, service, or industry economic productivity. And in the literature, you can find there is something like a peak temperature for GDP productivity of the different sectors, agriculture, service, and industry. And if you have these three factors, the difference in country temperature, the GDP composition difference around the globe, and a peak temperature, when your economy can be at its peak by only measuring the input factor temperature, then you can come up with economic prospects in light of climate change. And one more time, if you take one thing away from this entire presentation, please take this. I only show potential economic rising prospects in climate change in order to show how to redistribute these gains into areas that will be losing. And this is grounded in ethical and partially also in legal foundations. So for instance, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, or the New School professor Hans Jonas' interpretation of Kant's categorical imperative that also includes the nature, really leads you to this notion that you should only engage in an action also towards the environment that you would like to have incurred on you. And if you consider John Rawls' veil of ignorance that says that you should really think about every ethical predicament without considering if you are winning or losing from it, then you come up with this natural idea that there should be a redistribution of potential economic gains across the world. Although also Nicholas Caldo's compensation criteria speak about when there is this possibility of a social welfare improvement of an entire society, you can enact this by winners transferring their gains to the losers if everyone agrees that there is a common problem and there's a potential of social welfare improvement. So my results will be focusing on redistribution mechanisms. I propose a new taxation and bond strategy in 4 different indices that integrate climate change gains and losses. The climate flexibility I also integrate. This I see as the range of temperatures a country can offer. Just think if a country can offer skiing resorts and beach vacation, the country has simply better trade assets than a country that only has one temperature zone. And I see, and this is heavily influenced by or inspired by the political economy roots that I enjoyed at the New School, I see it as a future climate wealth of nations trade asset if a country can offer different temperatures. I integrate also CO2 emissions, but also over time, if there are changes, in order to work with positive market incentives change and historically grown bank lending interest rates. Here, my more preliminary results. I look forward to the discussion also following this workshop. So what I can already now see in the data is the input variables mean temperature around the globe is distributed unequally. We see GDP compositions, agriculture, service, and industry sector are really different around the globe. There is in the literature already a peak temperature for GDP productivity per sector sector. And I didn't know from the literature, it varies. It says sometimes it's a linear, sometimes a prospect, sometimes a hyperbolic gains and losses around 1 degree more or less. So I calculated all 3 models and then took the mean. And we, of course, live in a changing climate. And if you take these 4 pillars together, then you can calculate the time ahead that countries have until they reach their individual peak condition for productivity given climate change. And in the world map, you see the greener the country, the more the country will see potentially an economic gains prospect in the next 100 years. And the red countries, they will run out of time the earliest. And the yellow countries are the countries that will be in peak condition in 100 years from now. And in the bar charts, you see on the left side, I show 1/3 winners in green, 1/3 losers in red, and yellow about the peak condition. But when you shift it to the actual 1/3 of gains, you see the green bar shifts up. Only a few countries in the world will be winning a lot in the next 100 years from climate change. And here comes now the inequality part. I already find now there's a highly significant correlation between being a climate change winner and greenhouse gas emissions, self-reported in the COPs. And I see climate-induced migration and financial inflow patterns. So you see this inequality that also the countries that are gaining from climate change are the ones who are kind of causing the problem. They get human capital inflows, and they get financial inflows already now. One more time, I only show these gains from a warming globe in order to find redistribution patterns. This is grounded in ethics of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. You should only engage in an action if you want to have it incurred onto you. Hans Jonas gives the extension. It also includes the biosphere and the natural environment. And John Rawls' veil of ignorance. Even if you're gaining from climate change, you have to evaluate the problem from a global, large-scale perspective, and Nicolas Caldor's compensation criteria that say if we can reach a social welfare improvement, then we should do it via the winners from climate change redistributing to the losing areas. And the first model that I calculate were GDP per inhabitant, factored that in. And as you can see in the graph below, the greener the country, the more the country is on the winning side per inhabitant, GDP prospect per inhabitant. And those are the countries that I advise should potentially use a taxation strategy, whereas the red countries, those will be the countries that have the least time ahead, and they have the most losses per inhabitant expected, and they are the countries that should potentially receive funding in order to transfer the gains of a warming globe into the losing areas. And the last piece, very preliminary, please, comments are more than welcome on this, are 4 indices in which I first phase in climate change gains and loss prospects and the CO2 emissions of a country. And here I come up with a world distribution where I say that the red countries, so China, and the yellow and light green countries, they are advised to be taxing, hopefully climate change causing industries, so industries that emit CO2. And in order to fund, and this is the novel aspect, a potential world climate bond that redistribute these gains into the losing areas. And those are the greener countries that have more of a loss prospect in light of climate change and less CO2 emissions. When I phase in the second index, climate flexibility, as this range of temperatures zones that a country can offer as a future wealth of nations trade method. You see red and yellow countries, so China, the US, and Russia are advised to use a climate taxation strategy, that if you use a progressive taxation, you could ensure that not some marginalized communities are also having a heavier burden, a proportionally heavier burden of the climate financialization. If you use a corporate taxation, you could also reap past wealth accumulation. And these countries or these funds that are raised from climate change winners with high climate flexibility and with climate flexibility, they should also be funding the greener countries that have a losing prospect and less flexibility and less CO2 emissions. The third index now also integrates the CO2 emission changes over time. And here you see that the US shifts from being a climate taxation country into a dark green country, so as a climate bonds recipient. And this would potentially, hopefully, set a positive market incentives in order to shift the competitive race to the bottom for producing very cheap price-cutting behavior. Would shift this more into a competitive race to the top, where countries would compete over cutting CO2 emissions, or countries strategically placing their production in territories of the world where they can produce still cheaper, because they would be funded or would have more access to capital via bonds, premium payments, if it's in a country that has a losing prospect, has less CO2 emissions, or changes CO2 emissions quickly over time. And the last index, and this is what I want to leave you with, is the fourth index that also integrates historically grown bank lending rates in order to really also integrate historical disparities and hierarchies that were built up. So there are different bank lending rates, and I have to say thank you to João Paulo Braga and the paper that he wrote with Professor Semmler and Andreas Lichtenberger that really inspired this, and it was also so nice to help me finding the data, and this shows that potentially China and the US should be the funding of greener countries that have a losing prospect, have less CO2 emissions, and historically grown harder time to access capital for innovation. And with this, I thank so much for the audience and look forward to hopefully some critique.
Thank you very much, Julia. We open now the floor for any questions and comments you might have.
I also see Mike Flaherty by now. He used to be my TA, or my professor TA. So I hope. Thank you so much for an amazing course with Professor Semmler. This came out of the course, so I hope you have comments.
I think my presentation is next, and I think it kind of lends well to that. So I think it's I enjoyed it, and I want to kind of pick up where you leave off, I believe. So if I'll kind of leave the floor to anybody else.
Maybe can I just say something? I think it's a great effort to say, well, how is the some climate justice across countries. First, one has to give some theoretical or foundation. Why do you want some redistribution scheme there from the winners to the losers? And countries are sovereign. And it's very hard to argue, well, you have to give up something here and to move this some transfers to some other countries. So that's why I think the issue of, how can you justify such a policy? It's a very important aspect, I think. Where we are a little bit struggling about, getting this model, so to speak, to the policymakers is the issue of But it's basically a transfer scheme that Julia devises there. So winners issue bonds that are somewhat repaid by, no, sorry, losers. No, winners lose bonds that are, oh, no, I got lost. The bonds are used for losers to repair and to adjust to the climate change, whereas the other group has to repay the bonds. That produces a problem, of course, that the user of the bond would issue bonds with high returns, with high yields. So in order to attract buyers of the bond, but the payers, or what Julia claims as the taxpayer for this, well, they would not agree on this. So one has to have some international institution like the Eurobond problem had that find some compromise between those two. And what is these international institutions that actually could do this? And so I think there's a little bit some open questions of what organization institution could do this, the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, or a new institution, or so, because it has to be mediated between the countries that repay the bonds and the countries that receive the receipts of the bond. So this is a little bit a difficult problem, but otherwise a very interesting new direction of research.
I mean, maybe also the WTO, of course, all the institutions that you mentioned, but I was thrilled to learn that the WTO has the first female director general. And it is my understanding she comes from Africa. So I hope also a legal or more legally sound institution. And there's one legal case where you can actually disown people legally. This is in the case when the possessor of a good is not alive anymore, and a country in international law has better means of protection and conservation. So the stone of Rosetta that was found in Egypt is actually in Great Britain, and they lost a legal case, an international law legal case, to reclaim this stone, because Britain makes the case it has better means of protection and conservation because it's exhibited in a national gallery with a lot of different art, which gives it a gestalt. And you can flip around this legal argumentation and you can say the future inhabitants of a favorable climate are not alive. And potentially those countries that have a rising GDP prospect have better means of protection and conservation of the climate economically, and therefore they also have a higher responsibility to protect and care. And for that one, you could also, and if you work and this is again really important, that you look into the disparate impact of all these measures. The Fed right now is also really looking into disparate impact of inflation, for instance. And you slice up the society and see that not marginalized groups have a heavier burden of the climate change problem. But with this, I think I should leave the floor to people who have educated me a while ago.
Julia, actually, we ran out of time already for your session. Thank you very much. Andy, I noticed your hand raised. If you can text her or send an email so that we can move forward to the next presenter, Ettore Gallo, who's going to present on green Goodwin, reduction of CO2 emissions, climate damage, and the persistence of business cycle.
Thank you. Could you see the slides?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Willi, João, Jose, for having me. So I'm gonna present a model of a business cycle model encompassing green investment and climate damage. So worth stressing, I'm a relatively newcomer to this stream of research, so I very much look forward for your questions and criticism after the presentation. So So this is the outline of my presentation. I'm gonna start with some motivation research questions before going step by step in explaining the building up of the model, and then present some very preliminary simulation results and possible extensions to really include to model climate damage and environmental degradation. So, all right, so just to give a bit of background, when looking at cumulative CO2 emissions, it seems clear to me, and actually not only to me, there is some research on this that argues for that cumulative CO2 emissions in the long run will follow a logistic pathway, meaning at some point, we will reach a turning point and CO2 emissions will steadily reduce up to carbon neutrality, which is, by the way, the only way we can possibly survive, because if cumulative CO2 emissions will continue rise exponentially, then we will not have many more workshops like this in the future. I mean, the cumulative CO2 emissions fit is actually pretty strong. This is a simulation that I run for at the world level using the data from the Global Carbon Project, and also at the country level. This is for the case of the US, but I think it's pretty easily replicable to other countries. In the US, probably, and in European countries, what's interesting is probably that the turning point on the logistic curve has been reached in the early 2000s. So, we are in a situation in which CO2 emissions are decreasing. Now, the problem with all of this is that, the carrying capacity of the system, we cannot take for granted that the carrying capacity of the system corresponds to a situation in which we can have, only minor long-run detrimental effects. Well, it's quite the opposite, as the IPCC report, the NGFS reports, and a very vast empirical, very vast literature shows. Even following even by advancing on the path of CO2 emissions, we are going to have pretty strong detrimental effects in terms of as caused by human-induced environmental degradation. So, the idea of the paper is, first of all, to assess how transitioning to green investment could play a key role in flattening the curve. Really, I mean, the background of all my analysis is something kind of similar to what we have seen with the COVID pandemic. One urgency for policymakers today is to flatten the curve, not of COVID infections, but of cumulative CO2 emissions. Advancing on strongly and faster on CO2 emission reduction and greenhouse emissions reductions more generally. And in order to do that, I mainly focus on the investment channel, which I think is something which is not really extensively done in the literature. In particular, I consider how green investment could play a key role in flattening the curve, moving away from carbon-intensive technologies and towards more environmentally friendly production processes. So why I'm arguing that this is relevant? Because first of all, investment, we all know from a macroeconomic perspective, investment volatility explains most of business cycle fluctuations in the short run. So transitioning to green investment will play a role also in the short run, but probably most importantly, it will allow to contribute to emission reduction in the longer run. So the research goals of my research are to first assess the interaction between the dynamic multiplier and the nonlinear accelerator principle in a short-run economic model, a la Goodwin. And second and third, probably most importantly, to incorporate the effect of transitioning towards green capital, and to see what the effect of will be on business cycle fluctuations and CO2 emissions reductions. And second, but this is still tentative, to simulate and calibrate the model to draw some policy implications. Okay, so let me quickly go through the model. First of all, this part is not really new. I adopt a Goodwin business cycle model, which is fundamentally rooted in the interaction between a dynamic multiplier and a nonlinear accelerator. And this is discussed in the literature by Goodwin himself, as well as by Gandolfo, Serena Sorti, and Zambelli. I'm not going to go through the derivation of the whole model, but the final equation which explains output determination and the dynamics of output over the business cycle is this one here, which basically says that output, the second derivative, it's a second order differential equation. The second derivative of output, so output acceleration, depends on aggregate demand minus aggregate supply minus a lagged difference, a lagged variable, which is the second part here. So Z is autonomous demand, which can encompass different demand components, such as autonomous consumption, residential investment, government spending, and exports. Kappa is total investment, and I will spend more time on these. Total investment is assumed to depend on a nonlinear accelerator, on a nonlinear accelerator, and then S is the economy-wide propensity to save, with epsilon and theta are both time lags. So what explains really the dynamic over the business cycle of this model is the nonlinear accelerator principle. So total investment will depend on changes in output. So over some middle range. So over this middle range, in total investment is just given by the product of the acceleration coefficient and delta y. Before passing to complete inflexibility to two extremes, a ceiling and a floor. And this is very convenient because it allows, unlike most of business cycle models, it allows to have to make the depression as different from the boom as we wish, as Goodwin himself says. And realistically, we are going to assume that the floor is always lies above the ceiling, meaning that in light with empirical evidence, is the expansion is usually stronger than the depression, given by factors like the indivisibility of investment and so on. Now, the main aim of the paper is really to incorporate green investment. So to do this in a simple way, I assume I consider total investment as given by the sum of green and brown investment. And I consider both of them as shares of total investment. So green investment will be alpha times total investment. Brown investment is, of course, 1 minus alpha times total investment. And since the model is formulated in continuous time, we can fairly assume that the adjustment speeds of green investment and brown investment are different. And in particular, what I assume is that the accelerator principle works stronger for green investment, meaning that also green investment is more responsive than brown investment to output changes as a consequence of technology diffusion and adoption. So at the end of the day, this makes the investment function slightly more complex, like this, but at the end of the day, it's really, the fundamental mechanism is still the same. We have a nonlinear accelerator, which explains investment over the business cycle.
Ettore, you have 5 minutes.
Yes. Do that. Now, when it comes to the dynamics of green and brown investment, I think that in light in line with the evidence on technology diffusion and adoption, I assume that green investment, that the share of green investment in total investment will evolve according to a logistic path, meaning that we are moving rapidly moving towards adoption of, hopefully rapidly moving towards adoption of green technologies. And at some point, green investment will be 100% of total investment. So, well, this share ranges from 0 to 1 and will rapidly increase in a middle phase, which we are hopefully approaching. And as discussed in the introduction, also CO2 emissions are likely to follow a logistic pathway determined by deterministic growth rate eta and limited by some carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is given really by the physical capacity, but even at the carrying capacity, if we arrive at the carrying capacity, we are most likely going to see major climate degradation and climate damage and environmental degradation. In order to include the interaction between CO2 emission and CO2 emissions reduction and green investment, I just consider that through some parameter beta, green investment, which is alpha times kappa, can reduce CO2 emissions. I mean, this is probably an oversimplification because, in order to be broadly consistent with the Kaya identity, we should also include the probably positive effect that autonomous consumption, other components of demand have on CO2 emissions. But just to capture the fundamental mechanism that I want to shed attention of, I just include green investment for reasons of tractability for now. But I mean, if we want to include other components of demand, I think this model can be quite fit for further empirical research. Okay, so the final model looks like this. I'm not gonna go again through all the equations also because I'm running out of time. But the interaction between all these these four variables explain how the model behaves over the business cycle, and this is some very tentative and purely illustrative purpose, a representation of how the system behaves. You can see that there is persistence of business cycle fluctuations, and also the corridor of the fluctuation is asymmetric. So the depression is milder compared to the expansion and also shorter. Alpha evolves from 0 to 1. I assume to be starting at the initial value of 10%. And you can see that CO2 emissions are flattened by the interaction by the increase in green investment. And they are also kind of fluctuating around the business cycle as a consequence of the nonlinear accelerator principle. So the second part, and I'm gonna be very brief on this, is to incorporate climate damage. This is very tentative in the analysis. So far my model maintains that a rather optimistic stance. We just need to increase green investment, and this will have positive effects on emissions reduction. But first, it's not given that we can do this quickly and efficiently and strongly enough to have a significant effect. The second important thing is that climate damage is already here and will have an effect on the business cycle. So I propose to include this in a stochastic manner by including a set, one Brownian motion on output, weighted by some square root of output to have a strictly negative effect. Okay, let me just really conclude real quick. So I developed a Goodwin model to assess the interaction of CO2 emissions and the green investment over the business cycle. And I assess but for further empirical and theoretical research, what I really try to do is to more carefully calibrate and simulate the model, to also to draw more relevant policy implications, to carefully assess what's the strength and speed required for green investment to substantially reduce CO2 emissions in line with the established targets, while avoiding massive climate damage and massive effects on the business cycle of climate damage and environmental degradation. Oof, sorry for these are the references. Sorry for running a bit out of time, and thank you very much for your attention.
Don't worry, thank you very much, Ettore. You have more or less 4 minutes for questions and comments. So anyone interested, please raise your hand. Oh.
Sorry, I have a question. You have different effects depending on the kind of investment. So if it's green or brown on income, because I couldn't see that.
Yes, actually, the accelerator principle works for total investment.
No.
You know,
I'm just talking about if the effect is different depending on the kind of investments. So if you have green investments, maybe you have different effect on income than brown investments. I know that you have this equation for K, but this is for in general, no? Yeah. And that it depends on the cycle, whatever. And also regarding the impact of the climate change, maybe you have to rewrite that this disturbance, because that is just noise. You know that doesn't mean so much, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So for the first part, no. I mean, the only difference between green and brown investment is that they may have different adjustment speeds. And at the end of the day, I just assess the effect of green investment in CO2 emissions reduction.
Mm-hmm.
On the second part, you are right. Yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking about that. This is, as I said, I mean, it's wrote here. This is very tentative. But this is a noise, but the fact is that if I weight it by the square root of output, I must ensure that the effect is strictly negative. So the noise, the stochastic noise is a strictly negative one. So there is a negative effect on climate degradation, but I'm still not sure this is the best way to model. And
you should maybe you should model depending on the level of CO2, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This was the other alternative, really.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You are welcome.
We have a second question from Gabriel.
On the screen now. Sorry for this. I wasn't polite. Sorry. Now I have the light, so I can share the screen. Sorry for this.
Gabriel, you can ask your question really quickly, please.
I'm going to be very fast. I mean, this was a really very amazing presentation, a very interesting research. My question was more about you are talking about bringing stochastic noise, for instance, to the model. There's the Fitzhugh-Nagumo dynamical model of a spiking neuron, that you have oscillations that are created for by noise. Sometimes when the noise exceeds a threshold, you can have a kind of oscillation. So maybe you can also look there if you're interested in dynamical models with stochastic noise. I mean, it's a model of spiking neurons. So. And then also I was wondering the relationship. I mean, it really resembled a lot the Kaldor's dynamical model, so that he also has this kind of tripartite division of the accelerator model. So I wanted to know if you have thought of relating them, or you just decided to go for that particular kind of model for simplicity, or Sorry, I tried to make the question as fast as possible. I don't know if I was clear enough though.
No, I mean, for the first part, I'll take this as the suggestion. I'm really still thinking about the stochastic component. So, I mean, let's also
I can send you the papers about that.
Yeah, thank you. On the second part, are you referring to the accelerator principle, right? Because I think that the relation between Kaldor and Goodwin is actually more on output determination, the idea of the dynamic multiplier. I see this as, you know, I just don't know, but I don't recollect any paper by Kaldor having a piecewise investment function like Goodwin has, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, I can maybe, I don't know, it's like my bad
Sorry,
memory,
guys.
but there. Oh, sure.
Sorry, we are out of time already. But,
okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
Michael,
so I will contact you later. Sorry.
Okay, sorry guys. So Michael Flaherty is going to be our next presenter. He's going to talk about balancing adaptation with mitigation, incorporating shorter-term loss reduction with longer-term sustainability objectives. Please, Michael. You're on mute.
Unmute. Okay, sorry. What I'll be presenting today, first of all, thank you guys. Thank you, Willi. Thank you, everybody that's organized and put this together. And then also, like I mentioned a little bit ago, part of thank you, Julia, because I think the climate justice piece she presented on will lead nicely into what I'm talking about here. So I'll try to be brief. What I'm talking about with this presentation is just a small portion of the overall research project I'm working on here. But I think it's an interesting way to kind of look at this, the balance, you know, as it says, the balancing of adaptation objectives with mitigation objectives. So what I mean by this is there are kind of broadly two categories of climate policy: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is of the utmost importance for long-term sustainability. This is the, you know, the green path. This is the sustainable energy production, renewable resources, and so on. I think this is probably what most people would think of when they're thinking of green investment. You know, this is the path towards sustainability. But at the same time, climate change is not just like a looming threat. Climate change is being realized kind of, you know, already. And as it becomes more and more a reality, more and more a norm, the other objective, adaptation, will be kind of more and more a bigger portion of climate policy. So what I mean by that is, you know, on the one hand, you have transitioning to the green economy. On the other hand, it's policies that protect citizens, protect residents from existing or near future catastrophes. There's a lot of literature that talks about, you know, potential co-benefits of, you know, certain policies might be good for mitigation, might also benefit adaptation. But for the sake of this little presentation, I'm kind of imagining or asking us to consider the cases where they're not, where it's a choice between mitigation and adaptation. So this is kind of just how I generally would frame the climate change discussion. You know, if I'm teaching a course or if, you know, anything similar, kind of often work up through these three escalating questions. Is climate change real? You know, and you can go and look at data and, you know, easily pull down trends, you know, historical highs, historical lows, find like, you know, the story that climate is changing. After that, it goes on to, is climate change driven by human action? And, you know, you can go and look into the evidence there. And then finally, is it something that requires action? And this is where like the kind of cost benefit analyses come into play, looking at what potential damages mean, looking at what, you know, preventing those damages costs and so on. That's kind of how I, you know, framed things in years past. And the question I'm going to add to that now is that assuming all those, assuming that, you know, policymakers are more and more on board with the fact that climate change is real, driven by humans, and that action is required, is it possible to prioritize mitigation and adaptation, or like, can we agree that mitigation is of the utmost importance, and, you know, keep the flashlight on that? There's some inspiring literature presented here. First of all, there's a growth model as part of this project that's not going to be presented today, and that's takes off from this Tony Bonin, Willi Semmler paper listed up top, develops, you know, from that. This work is also kind of inspired by this dynamic adaptive pathway literature, which talks about, you know, different adaptive pathways. You know, choosing project X leads to one kind of trajectory, whereas choosing a different path leads to a different trajectory, and a different set of ensuing, you know, adaptation policies would follow. But what I'm focusing on here today is kind of this game theory portion of it. So this I'm taking largely from, as far as my version of it, is an unpublished Bowles, Foley, and Halliday book. It might be published now, I'm not sure, I'm sorry about that, but it's something we used to teach micro a couple of years ago. And then there's some game theory articles specific to environmental economics, specific to the climate change discussion. However, nothing I've found, pardon me, has really kind of, it tends to be the case that it's presented as opting into, you know, a climate agreement or opting out. What I want to ask everybody to consider, or what I want to talk about today, is players, countries facing the decision to take their green investment money, their climate investment, and are they going to invest in mitigation, or are they going to invest in adaptation? It's a gross simplification. Like I said, there are lots of projects with overlapping benefits, co-benefits. But what I want to do here is kind of show the trade-off of mitigation policy with adaptation policy, and moreover, show how the kind of characteristics of these two policies can lead to like suboptimal outcomes. So our kind of simplification is mitigation is aimed at curbing emissions or absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, anything that kind of reduces, you know, atmospheric greenhouse gases. The case with it is that the benefits of mitigation are realized globally, and the benefits accrue on a longer time horizon. So the the mitigation investment carried out today by, you know, country X affects not only country X, but all, you know, all members of the planet. And it doesn't really it doesn't bear fruit for decades, essentially. You know, the solar plants that are built, the wind farms that are built today don't, you know, immediately reduce that greenhouse gas level. And they don't, there's the inertia kind of in play that certain climatological hazards and disasters are going to continue and grow for a while. Adaptation, on the other hand, as we're kind of simplifying it, assumes there's some amount of climate change that's going to happen, and it's aimed at minimizing the impact on citizens. And then, so what I ask here is just, the benefits are going to be realized locally when country X builds a seawall or invests in cooling or whatever. It generally it's going to benefit the residents of country X. And the benefits accrue in the years. Okay, that went fast. Okay, so the setup of the game. Prisoner's dilemma. We're kind of familiar with what a prisoner's dilemma is, and I'm going to argue that this trade-off kind of results in prisoner's dilemma and under certain conditions. So here's the general form of the game. There's some global benefit so it's 2x2, simple, 2 players in this game. If both engage in mitigation action, this global benefit is XG. If they instead engage in adaptation, it's privately realized benefits Y1 and Y2. And then further, I'm asking, that there's kind of 2 parameters to consider: the share of benefits that accrue to a country from mitigation, and the responsibility of climate change that accrues to a country. And this is where this kind of relates to Julia's paper, I think. The drivers of climate change, the large contributors to climate change, are often not the ones that are going to reap the costs. So the benefits of action don't accrue to the people causing the damage in the first place. So that's the kind of setup. What I'm interested in is imagining a situation where mitigation is the best optimal scenario, and then looking at what differences, what changes in these parameters lead to mitigation not being chosen. In other words, how can I, what happens as phi and alpha change that pulls the game away from mitigation, and lands us kind of in the prisoner dilemma scenario. So here's kind of the simple breakdown. If you took that and did some of the math to it, essentially if Y1, for example, is less than alpha 1, phi 1, xg, then mitigation is the dominant strategy. If yi is greater than that, then adaptation is chosen. So this indifference section is what I'm interested in. I don't know what to call it, but I'm going with indifference plane for the remainder of the presentation. And the question I wanted to look at is what happens to this, level of indifference as these parameters change. So first of all, assume a kind of equal responsibility, equal vulnerability to climate change. You get a picture like this. Mitigation, the benefit of global mitigation is shared evenly, if mitigation is chosen. And if mitigation is not chosen, the private benefits are realized. And then this just follows the kind of general setup from earlier. So plugging in some numbers.
You have 1 minute, Mike.
What's that? I'm over time.
You have 1 minute left.
Okay, so let's cut. So in the even distribution, there's adaptation would be chosen in this case, which has a global benefit of 560 million, which is less than the 1 billion benefit to mitigation. Then quickly, I'm going to look at example 2 and 3. Example 2 is if alpha and phi move together. In other words, the country most responsible for climate change also stands to benefit the most from mitigation. In this case, the kind of indifference level is at this 0.81 xg for Y1 and 0.01 xg for country 2, essentially meaning about 82% of, this adaptation would be, using that 1 billion example, somewhere over 820 million. So it's a better global outcome in the case where damage is kind of internalized. And then finally, in the case, and this is kind of again to Julia's article, where the contributors to climate change damages are not the ones that stand to benefit from mitigation. This the indifference point, the point where people switch from mitigation policies to adaptation, is very low. It's at this 0.09. So in that case, it's essentially $90 million for each country would incentivize, or a hair over, would incentivize them to move away from mitigation. So here's this sort of indifference matrix. This is the Y1 plus Y2 for the different parameters. As responsibility moves completely counter to the benefit from mitigation, the incentive to switch from mitigation to adaptation, the threshold bar is lowered. So I guess implications for this is just that in a scenario where countries are, where there's an imbalance, where the country doing the most damage is not the country that stands to gain the most from mitigation, it's going to be easier to lose sight of the mitigation objective. It's going to be easier to switch to the policies that are, that have private benefits, these kind of adaptation benefits. This is again kind of crudely overstating, the types of policies, and it doesn't mean to take away from the fact that adaptation is important, but it's just kind of this, this maybe, I don't know, just this insight into why and how adaptation policies might become more prevalent, might become more desirable, when you have this imbalance in who's causing the damage and who's feeling the damage. And I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We are lagging a little bit behind our schedule, so we have time for maybe one question or comments. If you have, please raise your hand. João, please.
Yeah, thank you. I have a quick comment, Mike. When I was listening to a presentation, it came to my mind there's policy actually that some countries are implementing, actually the European Union are discussing on carbon trade adjustments in order to avoid our carbon leakage and free riders. So my question is, at what extent your model can consider this type of policy and discuss it? But that's it. I think it's a very up-to-date discussion, your paper.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I would have to, so one of the things that occurred to me as Julia was talking, I don't know if this exactly addresses that, but the more you can, for example, tax the contributors and distribute that to the non-contributors or the victims or whatever you want to call it, the more it moves from that uneven to the kind of internalized case. I'm not sure that exactly addresses the type of carbon trade adjustment thing and the leakages. I'd have to look into that a little bit more. And so I will maybe can reach out to you after this, but I don't want to pontificate and slow things down.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Michael. We move forward now as we host Tato Kundazzi. He's gonna talk about regime switching in consumption behavior. So Tato, please, the floor is yours. Tato, we're not hearing you, but you're not on mute neither, so maybe you have a problem.
Can you hear me?
Now it's good.
Great, so we found the solution. So yes, I just thanked Professor Semmler and you, Jose, and Joao, and others who contributed in organizing this great event. Before I start, I should make two alerts. First of all, it's kind of the very initial phase of my research project. So I will be presenting today not the results, but just an idea of this research project. And then secondly, it's not about climate change, it's only tangentially related to climate change because it's on consumption theory. Okay, now so what is my aim in this project is to evaluate if there is a non-linearity in conspicuous consumption. Okay, so for instance, firstly, we should define what we, oh, it doesn't move, good. Great. So what we mean under conspicuous consumption, as you may know, it comes from Veblen, Thorstein Veblen, from the theory of leisure class. And it's basically means that lower classes are emulating consumption patterns of richer classes. And unlike neoclassical interpretation of consumption, where we, in their minds, in their theories, consumption are kind of, the preferences are exogenous and we are making decisions through indifference curves, in Veblen, these are socially developed. We are comparing our consumption patterns and it's a hierarchical. And actually, we are displaying our wealth to kind of keep up with a social prestige and through extensive leisure activities and expenditure on consumption and services. But as you already may know this, and it's not without critiques. There is some criticisms that, for instance, one of the criticisms is that consumer does not display their wealth anymore in the same level. And this criticism already kind of existed right after the after the end of the World War II. For instance, John Kenneth Galbraith mentions that people are no longer, so everyone can afford so many that people are just cease to be useful. This conspicuous consumption and displaying the wealth cease to be useful as a mark of distinction. And also some works of postmodernists, which says that this emulation is not just unidirectional, but it can be bidirectional. So rich classes can also emulate poor classes or middle classes. And yes. In addition to that, not only consumption itself of the goods and services, but also displaying of lifestyles is important in terms of maintaining the social status. Okay, and there is also very important contribution of Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist, and he developed the idea of habitus and cultural capital. Which is very important in terms of kind of when we are discussing question of consumption and consumption patterns and conspicuous consumption, because it also emphasizes the fact that there can be some other forms of displaying your social prestige, and it can be completely horizontal when the classes, within classes, there could be some kind of emulation of consumption behavior. Okay, so I want to mention also one, actually, not many of them, but there are many, but several, but I only want to mention one. The recent development in the consumption theory and conspicuous consumption theory. This is an excellent work by Bertrand and Morse. The article called the trickle-down consumption. And there is a reason why I'm quoting this and showing this, because I want to use and develop my research on their data sets which they created and extend it in a way so that it fits my model. Okay, but what is their kind of basic suggestions in their findings? They find that they compare in the regression consumption of the rich and consumption of the lower classes, and they find a positive relationship between this, and then they oppose the Friedmanian understanding of permanent income hypothesis, because it also can explain why poor and lower classes are increasing their consumption when rich increases. Because Friedman's explanation would be that they're expecting the growth of their future income, and that's why they kind of increase, the lower classes increasing their consumption when richer classes are increasing their consumption. So, and they, as I mentioned, they find the positive relationship between the consumption of rich and of non-rich, and yes, and they use the consumer expenditure survey to evaluate their model. So what is my idea? Go back to my idea. I want to see if there is a non-linearity in conspicuous consumption. Does it always happen that poor classes, lower classes are trying to emulate the richer classes with the same slope of the consumption of the richer class? Is there always the same slope, or there is some kind of differences? For instance, maybe a level of inequality, income inequality and wealth inequality differently affects patterns of consumption. And maybe crisis and wars may pose or decrease degree in conspicuous consumption, right? Or another important variable, which I'm gonna use as a transition variable, is the rise of social networks. Social media might have specific influences on conspicuous consumption, because if we look at it from the network theory, we see that these nodes are becoming quite close, and people are more exposed what other people are consuming through social media, and business enterprises quite actively using this to actually to foster conspicuous consumption, for instance, through influencers, right? And it's just a diagram to see the level of, I guess it's not so much important, but we see this kind of how the users of social media users increase after 2005, right? There is a huge jump, and on now share of US households using specific, like a social media is around, in this case, around below 80%. So how I'm going to evaluate this model, and I will be using panel smooth threshold regression developed by Gonzalez, etc. And why it's good model? Because there is no just several regimes, but there is a smooth adjustment. There is a smooth adjustment. So, and it's, I would say it's more closer to real world. For instance, if the social media number of social media users are increasing, it does not mean that automatically lower classes in one day will kind of increase their consumption drastically. So the slopes will be kind of, it will not be so much kind of different, right? It will change smoothly. And
you have
yes,
a little bit more than 4 minutes.
Yeah, I will finish soon, like in 2 minutes. So here, I just put it as a function kind of to evaluate this model. So what we have here is a consumption of the rich. Okay, it can be a consumption of 19th percentile or 18th percentile, depending on the specification. And it's a consumption of the non-rich. Okay, so again according to kind of percentiles. And here we have a transition function, logistic function. Actually, this variable is a transition variable. In this case, I'm gonna use, for instance, a number of social media users, or it can be hours spent in social media, okay, as a transition variable, and it's a slope of the transition variable. And so this is good because I will be able, in this case, I hope so, to see that there are some different slopes and there are some different regimes, and the pathway from one regime to the another is very smooth. But let's see. So I'm going to evaluate in this model when I kind of finish the paper. Yeah, this is a graph of the slopes, but actually of this threshold variable, so how this smooth transition may happen depending on the parameters. And I should mention that I already made some kind of pre-test of this kind of my idea. I took, but only on kind of time series data. I took the expenditures by income, these deciles, and compared, kind of used the VAR vector autoregressive model to compare the kind of and evaluate this model if lower classes are trying to emulate the consumption of the richer classes, and in terms of expenditure, if they spend more when the rich spend more, if the lower classes are spending more as well. And in this stage, I kind of found that there is expected signs of coefficients, and but it needs some more development. There are some bidirectional effects, and in some cases, insignificant coefficients in some cases. Okay, so what are my plans? So my plan is to kind of, it will take a lot of time to adjust the data set from consumer expenditure survey to my model. And because it should be panel, and I should take into account this. And also I'm going to use a University of Michigan survey of consumers. This will be a first stage, and I already shown the model, what I will be using. And then in the future, which will be, I hope, another chapter of my dissertation, will be on using statistical network theory for explaining the role of social media and conspicuous consumption. Okay, so we can say that in terms of evaluating, to finalize my kind of presentation, in terms of evaluating non-linearity of conspicuous consumption, the idea of social media kind of provides a natural experiment for this. Natural experiments, because it drastically kind of changes consumption patterns of societies. This is my kind of basic assumptions. Thank you very much, and I will be very happy to hear your comments, your thoughts, because it's the initial phase of my research, and your comments will be most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tato. Comments and questions from the audience? João Cooperman, please. You're on mute.
Yes. In terms of conspicuous consumption of those values, isn't it a real judgment call also in saying that what people with less fortunate desire, you could also just minimize their legitimate desires as just saying that it's conspicuous consumption? I mean, I think there's a problem of how we characterize those values, whether they're real or not real.
Oh, also, can you repeat your question, because I didn't understand
when
what
you're
you
saying
mean.
when people want to emulate the people who are above
Yes.
them, but just labeling it as conspicuous consumption, it can also just minimize people's real desires in terms of sharing the good life or whatever. So it's like it's a really strong value judgment.
Yes.
You know, who's got the right in some ways to determine what's conspicuous consumption and what's real consumption? I guess, is there a bias that's inherent in your model?
Yeah, it's a good question. Good question. Yes, but I think that from the sociological perspective, I would say that people are trying to emulate the consumption of the rich, because in order to maintain their social status or portray their social status, right? So I think in this case, it is right to call it conspicuous consumption, right? It's not only because, so there is a nice phrase of by John Maynard Keynes, right? People want to live not only to have a good life, but also to live better than others, right? So people are always trying to compare their consumption, their kind of life to other people. So yes, it can be biased, but this is a way how I see. Maybe I should think more about your question. You are muted. Can you?
I think also there's a little bit of a trap that people start thinking that if they just use minimal consumption themselves, that's changing the whole model. So I think that's part of the problem, that all of a sudden people lower their gas consumption a little bit, or they buy organic sheets or the like, that it's enough. So I think it's very important not to just limit it to consumption.
Yes, but now we are going to the policy field. What should be done, right? So in this case, and for instance, the authors which I am quoting, they propose to increase the wealth tax or increase the progressive taxation, and also increase or create a specific tax, for instance, which will specifically deal with the conspicuous consumption, right? For instance, why people are buying new iPhones, like when there is so much big difference between the latest version of the iPhone and the prior version of the iPhone. Why they do so? Because the major kind of, so this is a kind of trick of the conspicuous consumption. They do so because when you have the latest version of the iPhone, in this way, you are displaying your social prestige. So in the capitalist world, the system, it works in a way that your kind of personality is valued only in that case if you, for instance, have the latest model of the iPhone. Otherwise, your social prestige is not so much on that level. So this is a kind of a trick of the, I would say, conspicuous consumption, and this is an important policy debate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Joel, also. We move forward now to host João Paulo Braga. He's the next presenter, and he's going